The wagon stopped before she expected it to. No announcement, no final words she could point to later and say that was the moment. Just the creak of wheels going still and the sudden absence of motion that had been her world for 11 days, and then her father's voice from the seat above. He said, "This is where you get down." She looked out the canvas cover at the road, at the dust settling, at the flat Wyoming sun burning everything the same color of pale judgment. Two stone pillars stood 50 yards ahead at the entrance to a settlement she could barely see from here. Between those pillars and where the wagon had stopped was a stretch of road that was nobody's land. Not the town's, not her family's, just road. Her name was Cora Wells. She was 20 years old. She had a daughter 9 days old and $8 sewn into the hem of her dress by a hand she had not seen. Due it a gift found only when she pressed the fabric between her fingers on the second morning of travel and felt the coins there like small hard secrets. She got down. She had been expecting this, or something like it. She had been expecting it the way you expected a storm after 3 weeks of wrong weather. You didn't know the hour. You knew the hour was coming. Her father did not look at her. Her mother looked at the horizon. Her younger sisters, 3 of them, watched from under the canvas with the wide, careful eyes of children who understood that what they were watching would cost them something if they reacted to it. So they did not react. They looked. And Cora looked back at them long enough to make sure each one of them saw that she looked. The eldest of the 3 was 12. She had their mother's hands and their father's expression, and the particular stillness of someone who was learning in real time what family meant in the version where loyalty required silence. Cora held her gaze for a moment. She tried to put something in that look. Not a message exactly, something more like a door left open. Then she turned away. The bundle her father had packed contained 2 dresses, undergarments, a small Bible with the cover worn soft as cloth, her grandmother's silver locket, which she had kept in her coat pocket since the morning they left, and a tin of crackers that would last 4 days if she was careful about it. The baby was in her arms. The baby had no name yet. 9 days old and unnamed because in the house where she had been born, there had been no ceremony for her, no gathering, no gift-giving, no visitors standing at the door with covered dishes and congratulations and the complicated goodwill that communities extended to new lives, even difficult ones. Nothing that would invite people to ask questions that required answers. Cora had named her on the 3rd morning of travel, sitting alone in the wagon bed while the rest of the family slept. She had whispered the name to her daughter in the dark where no one could hear and no one could take it away. Mina. Her name is Mina. The wagon lurched forward. She watched it go. She stood on the road in the August heat and held her daughter and watched the wagon get smaller and smaller down the road until the dust from the wheels swallowed it entirely and there was nothing left to watch. The sound of the wheels faded. The sound of the horses faded. And then there was nothing but the wind off the plains and the distant sound of the settlement ahead, which was the same kind of nothing, just populated. She turned toward the stone pillars. She walked. She had been in Wyoming territory for 11 days, not counting the time before, and in those 11 days she had learned that Wyoming was not a landscape that accommodated ambivalence. The sky was too large for that. The space between things was too deliberate. You were here or you were not going somewhere, or not standing or fallen. The in-between states that other places allowed the half-decisions and the provisional arrangements and the things you were still thinking about, those did not survive long at this altitude under the sun. They burned off. What remained was the decision. The settlement was called Sweetwater, and it was not what the name suggested. It was what every frontier settlement was in 1875, which was a single street of ambition and compromise, the saloons and gambling halls having won more square footage than the church and the general store combined. The street was packed dirt the color of old bone. The buildings were raw timber gone gray from 1 or 2 seasons of wind. The smell was horses and coal smoke, and the baking heat pressing everything flat and underneath, that the Swedish decay of the stockyards at the north end where a cattle drive had passed through 3 days prior. The mud churned up by the herd had dried into hard ridges across the main street that caught boot heels and sent women sideways. Everything carried a smell. Sweetwater was a place that announced its nature the moment you walked into it, which Cora had come to understand was a form of honesty. She went to the stagecoach station first. The man behind the counter looked at her the way men looked at women who arrived alone and already tired. Not with interest, with the mathematical calculation of what her presence would cost him. He had the red-faced ease of a man who had made all his important decisions years ago and was now managing their consequences without particular complaint or enthusiasm. He looked at Mina the way he had looked at Cora, which was as a unit of calculation rather than a person. She asked about work, cleaning, cooking, anything that could be done with a child nearby. He said, nothing for a woman with a baby. She said, what would change that? He said, the baby. She went to the laundry down by the creek. The proprietor was a woman called Mrs. Gilman, with hands so worked over by lye soap, they looked like they belonged to someone twice her age. The skin was cracked along the knuckles and faded to a grayish pink that no longer looked entirely alive. She was perhaps 40 and looked 60, which was what years of lye soap and creek water did, and she had the particular hardness of a woman who had made her peace with that fact and extended it to everything else around her. She looked at Cora the way she might look at a garment with a stain she had seen before. Not surprised by the stain, not moved by it, simply noting it as a feature that would determine what could be done. She said, I know who your father is. Cora said, then you know I work hard. She said, I know what you are. She said it without cruelty, which was almost worse, as a statement of category rather than judgment. You are the thing you are, and the thing you are cannot work here, and that is the complete sentence. She went to the hotel. The man at the desk said, full up. She said, you have 3 rooms with no keys on the board. He said, full up. She went to a boarding house on the east side of the main street that a woman in front of the general store had mentioned when Cora had stopped to ask. The woman who mentioned it looked at Cora the way people in small settlements looked at strangers when they had already been told about them. The Reverend's letters would have arrived before she did. Her father wrote twice a week without fail. He was a man who believed that correspondence was a form of stewardship, that the words you put on paper outlasted you and should reflect accordingly. Whatever he had written about her, it had arrived in Sweetwater ahead of her footsteps and made her introduction for her. The boarding house had a sign in the window. The woman who answered the door looked at the sign and then at Cora, and then said the room had been taken this morning. She went to the church. This was the decision she had told herself she would not make, and made anyway, because Mina had begun to cry, with the thin, particular cry of a baby who had been hungry too long, and the sound of it was the most direct and irresistible argument in the world. She stood outside the white clapboard building in the heat and thought about what she knew to be true. Her father's letters would have preceded her. He was a man of correspondence. Whatever the next town contained her name in it would arrive with its context. She went to the church and stood at the door and heard voices inside, and stood there for 3 minutes, and then she went back down the steps. Not today, maybe not any day. The sun had dropped lower, the shadows of the buildings stretching east. Mina had quieted but not settled, which meant she had exhausted herself rather than finding peace, which was worse. Cora's own hunger was a thing she had been managing the way you manage something with a known limit. You didn't think about the limit, you thought about the next thing. She was standing at the edge of the main street with the $8 in her dress, and the crackers in her bundle, and no room, and no job, and no plan that had survived contact with the actual town, when a door opened behind her. A woman stepped out, red dress, hair pinned up elaborate, the kind of face that wore paint professionally and had learned to look at women in Cora's situation with something complicated. Not pity exactly, something older than pity and more useful. The look of someone who had been standing where Cora was standing and had made a particular set of decisions about it, and was now on the other side of those decisions, neither entirely proud of them nor entirely ashamed. She said, looking for something in particular, honey? Cora said, work. A room. The woman looked at Mina. Something moved in her expression. The same complicated thing, but with more weight to it now. She looked at the baby with the attention of someone who was calculating not the inconvenience but the stakes. She said, not here. They don't hire mothers. Management's view is babies are unpredictable. She said it without cruelty. As a fact, she reached into her dress pocket and put a coin in Cora's hand. A dime. Then she pointed north. She said, past the Blacksmith's there's a cottage. The man who works it is named Jude Finch. He keeps to himself and most of the town keeps away from him, which is the town's loss, and your potential gain. Cora looked at the coin and then at the woman. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" The woman looked at Mina for another moment. There was something in the look that was not about Mina specifically, something that was about a version of herself or someone she had known or something she had been told long ago that she had held on to. She said, "Because that little one needs to be inside before dark, and I have opinions about children sleeping in the road." She said, "That's the only reason." She went back through the door. Cora stood on the street with the dime in her hand and thought about opinions and reasons, and what it meant that the one person in Sweetwater who had offered her anything without calculation was a woman in a red dress whose professional circumstances precluded any claim to the respectability that everyone else was so carefully protecting. She thought about that for exactly as long as it took her to start walking north. The blacksmith shop was at the north edge of town where the main street thinned out and the buildings stopped pretending to be in a city. Cora heard it before she saw it. The specific rhythm of a hammer finding iron solid and unhurried, the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was not interested in making it sound more dramatic than it was. There was no flourish in the sound, just the work. The steady declarative sentence of metal being told what shape it would take. The shop was timber and fieldstone larger than the buildings around it because a smithy needed room in ways that other trades didn't. The doors were open to catch what breeze there was. The forge light inside was orange in the afternoon shadow, the color of something ancient and reliable. Beside the shop, not beside it exactly, but adjacent to it, sharing the lot in the way that purpose builds proximity, a cottage. Small. One story. The window boxes had flowers in them, which was the last thing she expected, and the detail that lodged itself in her memory most specifically. Marigolds, she thought. Or something close to marigolds. Orange and stubborn, still blooming in August despite the heat and the dust, and the complete indifference of the landscape to whether they lived or not. She had stopped at the gate. Inside the shop, a shape moved against the forge light. A man. Large in the way that physical work made men large, not in the way that bulk made men large, but in the way that years of actual labor distributed mass through a body until the body seemed engineered for its purpose. When he came to the door, it was to set a piece of iron in the light where he could look at it properly, and she saw him before he saw her, which meant she saw his face in the unguarded moment before he knew he was being observed. He was perhaps 28, 29. There was a scar along his left cheek, starting below the cheekbone and running to the jaw, the kind of scar that had healed clean but had not been small when it was new. Old enough to have been through whatever had made it. Specific enough to suggest it had been made by something that had a direction and an intention. His hair was the color of iron ore in certain light. He had the expression of someone who spent a lot of time in their own company and had stopped apologizing for it. Not lonely. Something more deliberate than lonely. Chosen. He saw her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the iron, with attention. Not the kind of attention that evaluated or categorized or made decisions. The kind that simply registered. That said, there is something here, I am going to look at it properly. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You look like you've been standing since morning." She said, "Longer than that." He looked at Mina. He said, "How old?" She said, 9 days. Something moved across his face. Not pity, something more considered than pity. The expression of a man doing an arithmetic that was not about numbers. He said, "Come sit." There was a bench outside the smithy rough-hewn from a timber that had been doing this job for several seasons. The wood had that gray, smooth look of a surface that had been sat on many times, in many conditions by many different people, all of them needing somewhere to put themselves for a moment. She sat. She sat with the relief of someone who had been deciding not to sit for several hours, which was its own kind of weight coming off. The decision not to sit had required constant renewal every 10 minutes, and the renewal had cost something each time, and now she didn't have to renew it anymore. He disappeared inside the shop and came back with water in a tin cup and a heel of bread wrapped in cloth. He set both beside her without ceremony, without the performance of giving that required gratitude in return. She said, "I have money, I can pay." He said, "Drink the water first." She drank the water. She held Mina with one arm and ate the bread in small pieces with the other hand slowly, because she had learned the cost of eating fast when you hadn't eaten long. The bread was yesterday's, at least maybe the day before, but it was bread and it had substance, and substance was the category that mattered. He sat on an upturned barrel at the shop entrance and watched the street, not watching her, giving her the courtesy of looking somewhere else. This was a thing she noticed. That he understood the watching of a hungry person was its own form of indignity and declined to add to it. When she had finished the bread, she wiped her hands on the cloth and held Mina properly with both arms. She said, "My name is Cora Wells." He said, "Jude Finch." She said, "The Reverend's name, the one with the church at the south end?" "Wells." He said, "I know who he is." She said, "He's my father." Jude said nothing. He looked at the street. A horse passed going south. A man in front of the trading post across the way looked in their direction and then looked at something else. She said, "I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for work, something I can do with the baby nearby. Cleaning, cooking, whatever you need done." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was doing something, not absence, active. She had learned to read the difference between those two kinds of quiet in the first week of Mina's life, when she had been doing everything herself in a room she had been given temporary use of that had always felt like a loan someone was regretting. He said, "The cottage needs looking after. Cooking, cleaning. I eat in the smithy most days, so there's no grand requirements." He said, "I sleep in the smithy. The cottage would be yours and the baby's." She said, "People will talk." He said, "They already are. You standing at my gate is enough." She said, "It'll get worse." He said, "Probably." He looked at her directly. "Does that change your answer?" She thought about the hotel clerk and his 3 empty rooms. She thought about Mrs. Gilman's hands and her assessment. She thought about the church steps and the 3 minutes she had stood there and the decision she had made coming back down. She thought about the woman in the red dress who had not offered her the world or even a room. Just a coin and a direction and an opinion about children sleeping in roads, which was more practical kindness than anything else she had received today. She said no. He said, "Then we have an arrangement." He stood from the barrel. He gestured toward the cottage. He said, "There's a pump in the kitchen. The stove takes coal from the bin in the pantry." He said it the way someone gave instructions to a capable person, which was without condescension and without excessive detail. "I'll bring wood before dark." She said, "What do you charge for the room?" He said, "Whatever you make when you work. We'll settle accounts at the end of each week." She said, "That's not a number." He said, "No." He picked up the tool he had set down when he came out to look at the iron. "It's a starting point." He went back into the smithy. She sat on the bench for a moment longer and looked at the cottage with its window boxes and its marigolds and the door that led to the first room that had been offered to her without a calculation visible in the offering. Then she picked up her bundle and went inside. The cottage was as spare as the man who owned it and cleaner than she expected. One main room with a table and 2 chairs and a small iron stove with a water reservoir on the side. A shelf on the east wall with a row of crockery and a few canned goods and a clock that was running correctly, which she noted because it suggested someone was winding it. A bedroom with a brass bed and a quilt of faded blues, the fabric worn to a softness that came from washing rather than use. A rocking chair in the corner that had been sat in enough to have shaped itself to someone. She thought of Mrs. Abernathy, whose name Cora would learn later, whose chair this had been, whose flower boxes those were who had treated Jude like a son and died in the winter and left him the cottage and a grief he didn't discuss. She ran her hand along the quilt. She put Mina down on the bed surrounded by folded cloth so she wouldn't roll. She stood over her daughter for a moment and watched her breathe. In and out, in and out. The color of her cheeks was better than it had been this morning, better than it had been the morning before. Mina was a person who was working very hard at the business of being alive and doing it without fuss, which Cora had come to think of as her daughter's first and most essential characteristic. She went to the stove and built a fire the way she had been taught before she was old enough to remember learning it. She cooked eggs. She boiled water for tea. She sat at the table and ate with both hands free for the first time in 3 days and did not cry, which required more effort than the cooking had. Jude brought wood before dark as he said he would. He set it by the stove without coming more than 2 steps past the door. He looked at the room without looking at her, and she understood he was checking that everything was in order, which was the checking of a person responsible for a space rather than a person assessing an occupant. He said, "There's more coal in the pantry if you need it." She said, "I know. I found it." He said, "Good." He left. She heard him cross at the yard to the smithy. She heard the smithy door. Then nothing but the wind off the plains and the very quiet sound of her daughter breathing. Outside, the Wyoming evening came in fast, the way it did this far west. The light going from gold to purple to the hard blue-black of altitude without the slow courtesy of dusk. The forge sounds had stopped. Sweetwater was doing its evening business, the piano from somewhere south, a horse on the main road, a door slamming. Someone's laughter carried by the wind. She nursed Mina. She sat in the rocking chair that had been someone else's, and held her daughter, and felt the particular quality of a day that had contained enough to end several ordinary lives, all compressed into the hours since the wagon stopped. What she felt was not peace exactly, not relief exactly, something more structural than either of those. The feeling of weight finding a surface. She had $8 and some coins. She had a roof. She had a job that paid in shelter and a wage yet to be settled. And she was not going to think past tonight, because thinking past tonight was how you started owing debts to a future you couldn't see clearly enough to trust. She put Mina in the center of the bed and built a wall of folded blankets on either side. She lay down. She was asleep before she had finished deciding to sleep. The first sound came on the second night. She was awake in the dark, the way she was often awake in the dark now, because Mina woke twice in the night, and Cora's body had already learned to surface before the cry to be ready, before the need announced itself. She was lying with her eyes open looking at the ceiling when she heard it. A hollow thud. Below her, or not below her exactly, below and to the north, from the direction of the kitchen rather than the bedroom, like something dropped. Like something placed deliberately from one surface to another, muffled by distance, immaterial but definite in its rhythm. She lay still. Mina breathed beside her. In, out, untroubled. Cora listened. Nothing else came. She told herself old buildings made noises. She had lived her whole life in houses that said things at night that couldn't be accounted for in daylight. Floor joists settling. Wind through gaps. Mice in walls, which was its own category of sound, persistent and directional. This was a new house, and she was hearing it for the first time, and she was also exhausted in a way that reorganized sound made it larger than it was, gave it intentions it probably didn't have. She closed her eyes. She went back to sleep. The second sound came on the fourth night. Different from the first. Not a thud, a reverberation, a low tone sustained for a few seconds, not quite a hum, more like the sympathetic vibration of a string played near a piano, a sound that started in the chest before the ears caught it. She sat up. Mina slept. The sound stopped. She sat there for a long time in the dark, waiting. Nothing more came. The forge was silent. Sweetwater was whatever Sweetwater was after midnight, which was mostly quiet, with occasional punctuation from the south end of the street, where the serious saloon business happened, and didn't care what hour the rest of the town had decided on. She lay back down, but she did not sleep as quickly this time. She lay on her back in the dark and thought about the sound and about what was below her. She had explored the cottage in the 2 days since arriving with the attention of someone learning a new language, and she had cataloged what she found: the pantry with its flour bin and coal storage, the kitchen shelves, the single wardrobe in the bedroom that held nothing, the drawer in the bedside table with a button and a length of ribbon, and a folded piece of paper that said nothing on it. She could make out the writing, faded to near invisibility. She had noticed the coal storage door, heavy, good iron on the hinges, different from the rest of the pantry in that specific way. But she had not opened it. On the seventh day, she found the cellar door. She had been cleaning the cottage systematically, room by room, the kind of cleaning that was its own form of taking possession of learning a space by the work you applied to it. She had found the kitchen unremarkable in most respects: solid table, 2 chairs, the iron stove shelves along the east wall, holding crockery and canned goods in a row of glass jars with summer preserves in them, labels in handwriting that was not Jude's. Mrs. Abernathy's handwriting she would later understand. Years old, plum and apple, and something she couldn't identify that smelled of herbs when she lifted the cloth seal to check. The pantry was behind the kitchen, a narrow room with shelves on 3 sides, and the flour bin in the coal storage. She was measuring the shelves for a paper lining she intended to cut from the newspaper she had found under the bedroom mattress when she looked at the coal storage door with the attention that the task had given her and noticed it again. It was more than coal storage. She saw that now. The door was in the north wall of the pantry, low enough to require ducting built from planks heavier than the rest of the pantry construction. Good planks. Fitted close, the gaps chinked with something gray and hard. The latch was iron. Good iron, not the rough hook and eye of a cellar door left by the previous occupant. Something newer. Something that had been made by the same hand that made the iron brackets on the smithy wall. She put her palm flat against the door. The wood was cold. Cold the way things were cold when there was space behind them. Not the cold of a wall that was absorbing the night air and holding it in its material. The cold of an interior that didn't share heat with the rooms around it, that was receiving cold from somewhere else entirely. She lifted the latch. The door opened on hinges that had been maintained, not stuck, not swollen from seasons of moisture and neglect. The hinges moved smoothly in the way that things moved when someone had been applying oil to them with intention and regularity. Beyond the door, not coal, or not only coal, 6 feet of coal storage, yes. Black dust on the floor, the smell of it. The particular dry mineral smell of coal that was different from the smell of burning coal, the way wood was different from smoke. But behind the coal storage where the wall should have been was not a wall. It was a continuation, a passage going north and down. And in the passage 20 feet ahead, where it curved away from her sightline light. Not sunlight, not the weak gray of a window at ground level or a crack in a foundation. Lamplight, amber, warm, steady. The light of a flame burning in a space that held it, that had been built to hold it, that the flame had been put in by a hand that intended it to be there. She stood in the doorway of the coal storage and looked at the lamplight and listened. A woman's voice, low, speaking to someone. Not frightened, not panicked, not the voice of someone in crisis. The voice of someone telling a story or explaining something, or simply talking to make the silence less complete. And beneath it, almost below audible, the small particular sound of a child. Not an infant. Older, 3 or 4, making the small sounds that children made when they were not entirely asleep and not entirely awake. She did not go forward. She stood in the doorway for a long time and breathed the cold coal air and looked at the lamplight and understood that she was standing at the edge of something she had not been prepared for. Something that was not hers to walk into uninvited. Something that changed what she thought she knew about the man who had offered her a cottage and a wage and a bar on the inside of the door for her own safety. A man who had said the town doesn't know, and then had said what you do with the knowing is yours. He had said that 2 days before she found the door, which meant he had known she would find it, which meant the telling had been a preparation. She pulled the pantry door closed. She went back to the kitchen and filled the kettle from the pump and set it on the stove and waited for it to boil and thought about what she had just found. In the morning, she told him. He was at the forge before first light. She had seen the glow from the cottage window when she rose to feed Mina the orange pulse of it through the smithy's open doors in the October cool. By the time she came across the yard with 2 cups of coffee, the sky was the color of pewter at the edges, going to black above, and the stars were still visible over the western ridge. He took the cup. He did not ask how she had slept. She said, "I found the passage in the pantry." He held the cup. He looked at the forge, and then at the yard, and then at nothing in particular. He said, "I know." She said, "There are people in there." He said, 2 women. He paused. 3 days ago, there was also a child, but the child has gone on ahead to the next arrangement. She said, "Next arrangement." He said, "There are places further west where it's safer." He said it the way someone said a thing they had said before to people who had needed to understand it quickly and without ornamentation. The arrangement here is temporary, a few days, a week at most. She said, "What are they running from?" He said, "Their husbands mostly, sometimes their fathers, sometimes neither and both." She stood with her cup in the October air and looked at him. She said, "How long?" He said, "The house has been here 9 years, the passage longer." She said, "And the town?" He said, "The town doesn't know." He looked at her steadily. "Nobody who has been here has told anyone." She said, Are you asking me not to tell? He said no. She waited. He said, I'm telling you what is here. What you do with the knowing is yours. He turned back to the forge. She stood there for another moment with her coffee going cold. She thought about the choice she had been given and about what it would mean to make each version of it. She thought about the woman's voice she had heard in the passage, low and certain, speaking to someone who needed to be spoken to that way. She thought about Mina, 9 days old, sleeping now in the borrowed cradle Jude had found somewhere and brought in without comment. She thought about $8 in a hem. She thought about 3 rooms with no keys on the board and a man who said full up without looking at the keys. She said, I'll need to know where they come from so I can bring food without frightening them. He looked at her over his shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I'll show you tonight. He said, good night, Cora. He said, good night, Jude. The door closed. She turned back to the basin. Outside, the stars pressed down on the Wyoming territory with all the weight of distance and time. Sweetwater made its sounds. The forge ticked as it cooled. Mina breathed her steady newborn breath in the cradle by the stove. And in the passage behind the coal storage in the lamplight at the end of a corridor that nobody in the town officially knew existed, 2 women were sleeping safely through the night. Which was the point. Which had always been the point. The letter from her father arrived on the 11th day. She knew the handwriting before she opened it, had known it all her life from the sermon notes he made on Saturdays, that were not for anyone else's eyes, but that she had read anyway in the study when he was out, because she had always understood that what a person wrote when they thought no one was looking told you more about them than what they said from the pulpit. His handwriting was precise, controlled, the penmanship of a man who believed that the form of a thing expressed the character of the person who made it. Each letter fully formed, no shortcuts, no letters running together in haste. The writing of a man who had been taught that the way you made marks on paper was a moral matter. The letter was 4 sentences. It said, do not contact the family. You have made your choice and the family has made ours. We pray for your soul's recovery. Do not contact the family. The last sentence was the first sentence again repeated, which was what her father did when he wanted to make certain you understood that what he had said was not a position in an argument, but a conclusion already reached. The repetition was not for emphasis. It was for finality. It was the sound of a door not just closing, but locking. 4 sentences. No salutation. No signature beyond his title. Reverend A. Wells. She folded the letter along its original creases. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She went back to the kitchen and finished making breakfast, and did not tell Jude about the letter until the evening meal, and then she told him because it seemed dishonest not to, and because he had been honest with her in a way that was not required of him. And she had learned early that honesty given should be answered with honesty returned. He listened. He set down his fork. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was processing something rather than having nothing to say. He said, that's not the last word on the matter. She said it might be. He said no. He said it without softness or performance, with the particular certainty of a man who had learned through long observation how people moved when they had more room to move. He said, people write letters from their fear. Later they write different letters. She said, you don't know my father. He said, I know what fear looks like when it's dressed up as righteousness. She looked at him across the table. She said, that's a harder judgment than I expected from you. He said, I'm not judging him. I'm reading him. He picked up his fork. There's a difference. She thought about this. Mina was in the cradle by the stove. The fire was burning at the low, even height it needed to maintain the warmth without wasting fuel. Outside, the Wyoming evening was doing what it did, the sky enormous and indifferent, and shot through with stars at an altitude that made you understand how small the particular griefs of any given day actually were in the larger measure of things. She said, the women in the passage, can I meet them? He said, if they're willing. She said, how do I ask? He said, I'll ask for you. He paused. They decide. She nodded. She began clearing the dishes. She was at the basin when she heard him push back from the table. His footsteps crossed to the door. He stopped. He said, Cora. She turned. He said, I should have told you about the passage before you found it. That was not right of me. She looked at him, standing in the doorway of the cottage he had built into his own life, around the thing he had been doing quietly for 9 years, the thing that had made the whole town uneasy about him. Without their being able to name exactly why the thing that had made him a man, women in trouble were pointed toward by other women who understood what kind of trouble there was. She said, "You told me when I told you." He said, "That's not the same." She said, "No, but it's what you did, and now we know." He stood there for another moment. He said, "Good night, Cora." She said, "Good night, Jude." The door closed. She met them on the 12th day. Jude had asked as he said he would. They had decided as he said they would. Their answer came through him in the form of a nod at breakfast and an instruction to come to the pantry door after the noon meal when the settlement outside would be occupied with its own business. Their names were Vera and Patience. Vera was from a cattle ranch 60 miles east. She was perhaps 35 with the kind of stillness that had been learned rather than natural. The stillness of a person who had understood at some point that stillness was a form of not being noticed, and not being noticed had been for a period of time she didn't discuss the same as not being heard. Her right hand moved differently from her left. Cora noticed this without asking about it and did not ask. Patience was younger, 22 perhaps, though she had the eyes of someone who had absorbed more than 22 years' worth of information about how the world was arranged and for whom. She had come from Laramie on foot for the first 30 miles, which she mentioned with no particular emphasis, the way someone mentioned weather. The 30 miles had been a fact of her situation and she had addressed it and arrived, and that was the whole sentence. The third person, the child Jude had referred to, was already gone. A boy 3 years old with a serious expression that small children sometimes had when they had absorbed their mother's need for silence without being told about it. He had moved on to the next arrangement 2 days prior in the care of a woman who traveled west regularly with legitimate cause that made questions less likely. Cora would learn the structure of these arrangements gradually, the way you learned a new language not all at once, but in the order that circumstances demanded. The freestone house itself was more than she had understood from the doorway. She had been picturing a room, a large cellar, something improvised and approximate the kind of refuge that announced its limitations in every corner. What Jude had built into the limestone hillside behind the cottage over the course of 9 years was not improvised. It was considered. The passage from the coal storage descended at a gradual grade for 40 feet before opening into the first chamber, which was the main room. Rough walls smoothed by plaster where it mattered for warmth, left raw where the stone itself provided enough insulation. The ceiling high enough to stand in at the center. 4 pallets arranged along the walls on wooden frames, each with a wool blanket and a pillow stuffed with what felt like cattail fluff. 2 oil lamps on iron brackets that Jude had shaped himself and mounted into the stone, angled to throw light toward the center of the room rather than along the walls. A second passage from the main room opened into a storage chamber. Shelves on 3 sides holding canned goods in organized rows, dried stores and sealed crocks, a supply of the kind of staples that kept without spoiling. A water barrel fed by a natural seep from the limestone above, slow and steady, clean enough to drink the sound of it, barely audible but constant. Jude had lined the collection point with slate to keep the sediment out. The storage was not an afterthought. It was a considered calculation of how long people might need to be here and what they would need while they were. And at the back of the storage chamber, through a low door that required turning sideways to pass through the forge room, smaller than the main smithy, the bellows scaled to one person working, not a large body, putting full weight into it, but a person of ordinary size and ordinary strength who was learning rather than already knowing. The anvil a quarter of the size of the one outside. The tools hung on iron brackets in order of probable use, the ones you reached for first at eye level, the specialized ones lower accessible, but not in the way. Functional. A proper setup, everything in its place. The light came from an oil lamp on a high shelf and a gap in the stone above the forge that served as a flue and drew the heat upward and out so the room didn't fill with smoke. Cora stood in the doorway of the forge room and looked at it. She said, "He built this." Vera said, "Every piece of it. 9 years back, the passage was natural. He widened it. The rooms were caves. He framed them and plastered them and cut the shelves." She said, "How many women have been through here?" Patience said, "I don't know the total. He keeps a ledger somewhere." She said, "He keeps records." Vera said, "He keeps records of everything." She said it with the tone of someone for whom this had been unexpected and significant, as if the care of the record-keeping was itself a form of witness. Names, dates, where people came from, where they went. He says it so that if anything happens to him, the next person knows who passed through and how to reach them if there's ever need. Cora looked at the forge room, and then at the two women, and then back at the main chamber. She said, "What does he teach you here?" Vera said, "Whatever you can do with your hands in a week. Enough to sell something. He showed me how to make hooks and hinges. Simple things. I sold 6 of them at the trading post before I moved on. He knew someone who would buy them without asking too many questions." She said, "Mrs. Henley." Vera said, "That's the one." Cora nodded. She went back through the passage and up to the cottage and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and thought about what it meant that a man had spent 9 years building something under a hill because the world above it had not arranged itself to be sufficient. 9 years was a long time to work on something that most people in the settlement above didn't know existed. It was the length of time required to believe fully in what you were doing without needing anyone else to confirm that the belief was reasonable. She went back to the Freestone house the next afternoon, and the one after that, not to visit but to work. The bellows were not difficult to manage once you understood the rhythm. Push and release. Push and release. The bellows was not about force, it was about the timing of the air and what the fire did with it, which was open up, which was reach the temperature at which the iron stopped being simply iron and became something that could be asked to change its shape. She was not afraid of fire. She had been cooking on an iron stove since she could reach it with a step stool, and she understood fire as a thing that made demands and rewarded attention and punished inattention and was otherwise reliable. Jude came through in the evenings and showed her what to do with the heat when she had it, how to judge the color of iron for the right moment. The orange meant not yet. The yellow meant almost. The white yellow at the end meant it was time. Yellow meant almost. The white yellow at the edge of orange meant now. How to move quickly without moving carelessly, because hot metal had opinions about indecision, and indecision cost you the window, and when the window closed you had cold iron and needed to start again. The first thing she made was a hook. Bent iron. Simple curve. The kind of hook that could hold a coat on a wall or a harness strap on a peg, or a length of rope suspended above a floor. She had watched Jude make them, seen the motion of wrist and tongs and hammer, understood in her head what was required before she attempted it herself. The understanding in the head and the understanding in the hands were different categories of understanding, and the gap between them was where the attempts happened. It took her 4 attempts to get one that was even enough to be useful. She held it up when it had cooled, turned it in the lamplight. It was not beautiful, it was functional. It would hold a coat or a strap or a length of rope without question for the rest of whatever lifetime someone wanted to assign it. It was a thing that existed now that had not existed before she put her hands to the iron, and the world was slightly more furnished because of it, in a way that had nothing to do with the value of a single hook and everything to do with what making a single hook meant. She set it on the shelf and looked at it for a moment longer than was probably necessary. Then she made 3 more. By the end of the second week, she had a small tray of hooks and 2 sets of door hinges and a handful of harness rings that Jude had shown her how to form on the mandrel. Small work, basic work, foundational work. The kind that was not going to make anyone rich, but was going to establish that a person could do it, which was its own kind of currency in a territory where proving capability was the first step to anything. She carried the tray to Mrs. Henley's trading post on a Thursday morning with Mina against her shoulder, and the specific physical confidence of someone who has something to offer that was not present before. The woman who ran the post was perhaps 50 square-shouldered, with the manner of someone who had been deciding things for a long time and had made peace with the responsibility of deciding well. She took Cora's tray and looked at the work without speaking for a moment. Not dismissively, with the attention of someone who was actually assessing what was in front of them, rather than what they had already decided was in front of them. Then she said, "The hooks I can move. The hinges will take longer, there's less call. The rings I'll take all of them." She named a price. Cora named a slightly higher one. Mrs. Henley looked at her. She said, "You've been here 3 weeks and you're already negotiating." Cora said, "I've got a daughter to feed." Mrs. Henley said, "Fair enough." She named a price between both their numbers. Cora took it. Walking back to the cottage with Mina against her shoulder and money in her pocket that she had earned through the work of her own hands, she had a feeling she couldn't immediately name. It took her until she was back at the smithy gate before she understood what it was. Not happiness exactly. Something older than happiness. Something more structural. The feeling of a floor under you that you had put there yourself. Mrs. Henley came to the cottage on a Friday afternoon, which was her habit, apparently had been her habit for years. She brought a covered dish and a loaf of bread and set them on the table with the ease of someone who knew where the table was, who had been in this room enough times to have stopped being a visitor in it. She sat across from Cora. She looked at Mina in the cradle. She said, "She's gained weight since you came." Cora said, "She's eating well." Mrs. Henley said, "So are you." She said it without accusation, just observation. The observation of someone who had watched women arrive at that cottage in various states and watched them leave in others, and who had developed over the years the eye for what a month of food and shelter did to a body that had been doing without. Cora said, "How long have you known about the passage?" Mrs. Henley said, "Since 1866. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands flat on the table. She had good hands, working hands, the kind that told a history without requiring explanation. The skin at the knuckles showed her age, but the grip was still strong, and the movements had the efficiency of someone for whom the hands had been a primary tool for a long time. Then she said I was the first one he helped." Cora looked at her. She said, "My husband at the time was not a well man, in the way that some men are not well. He was what the doctor called excitable, and what I called dangerous, and what the law at that time called a domestic matter, and therefore beyond their concern." She said, "I had been in Sweetwater 3 years. I had a child. The child is grown now and in California and doesn't know the full story. I went to the church and to the sheriff's office and to the one doctor in the settlement, and each of them told me something different that amounted to the same instruction, which was to go home and manage the situation more wisely." Cora said nothing. She said Jude had been in the settlement about a year at that point. He had taken over the Abernathy shop when old Mr. Abernathy couldn't manage the work anymore. He'd come from Pennsylvania after the war, been apprenticed to a smith in Cheyenne first. I don't know why I went to him. Something about the way he watched, I suppose. He didn't look at people the way everyone else did. He looked at what was actually there. She paused. She said, "He didn't ask me anything. He just opened the passage door and showed me what was inside. He hadn't finished building it yet. The second chamber was only half done. The forge room didn't exist at all. He had a cot and a lamp and a week's worth of food. That was the whole of it." She said, "I stayed 11 days. When I left, I had enough skills to approach the trading post. Mr. Henley at the time owned it. He needed help with the accounts, which I could do." She paused. "He died 4 years later. Left me the business." She looked at Cora steadily. She said, "I have been helping Jude however I can for 9 years. Buying what the women make. Taking in things that can't go through other channels." She said, "I am telling you this because you have found the passage, and you are still here, and you appear to be a person who needs to understand the whole shape of a thing before she can decide what to do about it." Cora said, "You're right about that." Mrs. Henley said, "Good." She pushed back from the table. "The hooks you brought me Thursday, I've already sold 2. She stood. She said, "You have a good eye for the angle of the bend. Most people make hooks that curve too sharply or not enough. Yours hold the weight in the right place." She said it like a simple fact, not a compliment exactly, a technical observation offered to someone who had earned the right to receive it. She took her leave. Cora sat at the table after she had gone and looked at the door and thought about a woman who had walked into a half-finished underground passage in 1866 and come out 11 days later with the beginning of a different life, who had then spent 9 years as the quiet infrastructure of the thing, the person who converted the labor of the passage into money, who smoothed the transaction between what happened underground and what the world above required. 9 years. 9 years of women coming through. 9 years of Jude building and maintaining and keeping the lamplight going and the coal supply full and the ledger current. The quiet testimony of a man who had understood something about the world and had done the only thing he knew how to do about it, which was build something that held and keep building it. Seth Barrow arrived on a Tuesday. She saw him from the cottage window, a man on a good horse coming up the north road with the ease of someone who traveled often and had stopped needing to think about it. He was perhaps Jude's age, a few years older, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had been an officer and still moved as though there were formations behind him. His clothes were good and his horse was better, and he had the look of a man who had made decisions about his life and was now living inside those decisions comfortably. He called to Jude from the smithy gate. Jude came out. Something shifted in his posture when he saw the man. Not dramatically. The small degree of shift that happened in someone who had been alone for a long time and had just been joined by someone who knew them in the old way, the pre-settlement way, the way that predated the particular role you had taken on in this particular place. They clasped hands. Then the brief embrace of men who have survived something together, have stood in the same situations and made the same choices under the same pressures, and know without needing to discuss it what that means about the other person's character. She did not go out immediately. She finished what she was doing, which was feeding Mina, and then she went out. Jude introduced them simply. He said, Cora Wells, Seth Barrow. Seth said, I've heard of your father. She said, most people in the territory have. He said, I mean that as a neutral statement. She said, I know. He had dinner with them that evening. Seth and Jude and Cora at the small table, Mina asleep in the cradle. The fire in the stove holding the evening cold outside where it belonged. He was a man who talked well, not in the way of men who talked to impress, but in the way of men who had learned that talking well was a form of work, that you could move things with conversation the way Jude moved iron with heat, by applying the right pressure at the right moment and then waiting to see what the material did with it. He had been corresponding with Jude for 2 years about this, about the legal exposure of the passage, about what could be done to reduce it before someone decided to use it against them. He said, the problem is not what's happening inside the hill. The problem is that it has no official existence, which means anyone who wants to attack it can define it as anything they choose. Jude said, and your proposal? Seth said, we file paperwork for a legitimate business, a boarding house and a craft workshop, both legal enterprises in Wyoming territory. The boarding house status accounts for women residing on the property. The workshop status accounts for the ironwork. He looked at Cora. And now that there's someone here who can actually manage both, the paperwork is no longer a fiction. Cora said, who does the filing? Seth said, I do. My bank in Denver has the necessary relationships with the Territorial Records Office. She said, and if someone challenges it? He said, then we have documentation. The challenge becomes a legal proceeding with rules, which is better than a mob with opinions and fewer safeguards. She looked at Jude. He said he's right. She said, I know he is. She looked at Seth. She said, file the papers. Seth looked at Jude with an expression she couldn't quite read, but which seemed to contain something like approval. He said, yes, ma'am. He stayed 3 days. In the evenings, he and Jude talked until late, the low sound of their voices coming through the smithy wall, while Cora sat in the cottage rocking Mina and reading from the small library Jude had accumulated on the shelf beside the bedroom door. Practical books mostly, animal husbandry, engineering principles, a volume on territorial law, a volume of Dickens that had been read so often the spine had given way and been repaired with leather cord. She read the Dickens because she needed to be inside a story that was not her own for a few hours, and because Dickens was good at what he was good at, which was making the machinery of injustice visible without letting the visibility make it seem inevitable. On the second evening, she went to the Freestone house alone. The two women, Vera and Patience, had moved on 2 days prior to the next arrangement. The rooms were empty in the way that spaces were empty after people had recently been in them, the absence more present than if no one had been there at all. She walked through them, with the lamp checking the stores, noting what needed to be replenished. In the storage chamber on the lowest shelf was a wooden box she had not noticed on her previous visits. Because it had been behind a sack of cornmeal, she now moved to a higher shelf for easier access. The box was hinged plain timber, the lid secured with a small iron clasp that was not locked. She opened it. Inside, a ledger, bound in brown cloth worn at the corners. The pages thick and of good quality, the kind of paper bought with intention rather than convenience, because the information being recorded was intended to last. She took it to the lamp and opened it. The first entry was dated April 1866. 9 years ago, 2 months after Jude had taken over the Abernathy smithy. The handwriting was Jude's, the same precise and economical script she had seen in his account books applied to this different purpose with the same care. Name, date of arrival, date of departure or transfer. Where going when known. Any particular notes of condition or need. She read. She read slowly because the entries deserved to be read that way. Because each line was a person who had been somewhere terrible enough to end up here in a hill in Wyoming, in the lamplight of a room no one above ground officially knew existed, and who had then left for somewhere else. And the gap between those 2 points was the only story the ledger told about them, which was also enough of the story. Some she could see more in than others. A note in the margin left-handed. Demonstrated facility with the bellows. Another good with figures took the account book to study. Another with no elaboration did not want to talk and did not need to. That one she held for a long time. The economy of it. The respect in the economy. She turned pages. 1869. She was somewhere in 1866 near the back of that year's entries when a name stopped her. She read it twice. Then she held the lamp closer and read it a third time. Eleanor Pratt, March 1866. Arrived from Cheyenne. 1 infant daughter, approximately 6 weeks. Mother in poor condition, recovering. Departed April 1866 toward Laramie with contact provided. She looked at the name. Eleanor Pratt. Pratt. She thought about Edgar Pratt, whose horse she had seen at the church rail on Monday and at the hotel on Tuesday, whose reputation had arrived in pieces through Mrs. Henley's careful sentences and Jude's more careful silences. A man who had made her a promise and had made it from a position of sufficiency because he could, and had broken it when keeping it would have cost him something. She had wondered sometimes, in the way you wondered about things, you had decided not to dwell on what his mother had been like. You couldn't produce a man like that without something having gone wrong along the way, some sequence of decisions and consequences that had trained him toward believing that his comfort was the arrangement around which everything else should organize. Eleanor Pratt, 1866, 1 infant daughter. Edgar Pratt had been 25 in 1866. He would have been old enough to know if his mother had left. But had she left with the baby? Had he known about the baby? Had he known anything at all? She sat for a long time in the storage chamber with the ledger open on her lap and the lamp burning steady beside her, and the stone of the hill cold and permanent around her. She found a piece of cloth and set it carefully between the pages of that entry and closed the ledger over it and put the ledger back in the box and the box back on the shelf. She would need to think about what she had found, what it meant, what if anything should be done with the knowing. She went back through the passage and up to the cottage. Seth was leaving the next morning. She made breakfast early, and they ate it together, the three of them at the table, and Seth talked about Denver and the state of banking in the territories, and what he was seeing in the towns he moved through, which was the kind of practical intelligence that made his friendship with Jude useful to them both. After Seth had gone, Cora found Jude at the workbench. She set the wooden box on the bench beside him and opened it and turned the pages to the cloth bookmarks she had placed there and stepped back. He read it. He read it the way he read everything, without expression that could be taken advantage of. Then he was still for a moment. He said, "I didn't know who she was when she came through." She said, "Why would you?" He said, "I didn't know the name Pratt had a connection to anyone here. She was a woman in need. That was what I knew." She said, "The infant daughter." He said, "Yes." She said, "Edgar is 34. In 66, he was 25, old enough to know if his mother left. Whether he knew about the baby is a different question." Jude set the cloth bookmark carefully back in the ledger. He closed it. He put it back in the box. He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking he came here looking for something that isn't what he says he's looking for. He said he came for me and Mina. But when I asked him what he wanted from this settlement, he went still in a way that had nothing to do with me." She said, "I think he knows about his mother, or suspects, and the passage is connected to that somehow." Jude said, "If he knows his mother came through here, he knows she left with a child he has no knowledge of." She said, "A sister." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's not leverage. That's a wound." He looked at her. She said, "A man who has spent 9 years looking for something. his mother took away from him is not the same thing as a man who wants control. Those men can be moved if you find the right thing to move them with. Jude was quiet. He said, "What are you planning to do with this?" She said, "I don't know yet." She said, "But I'm keeping the ledger where I can reach it." A week after Seth had gone on a Wednesday night, Reverend Abel Wells came to the smithy. She knew it was him because she recognized the horse. A chestnut mare that her father had owned since before they came west, that her sisters had named Pearl when they were small, and her father had called it the Animal for all the years since, because he believed that naming livestock was a form of sentiment that led to poor decision-making. The horse was tied at the smithy gate. She watched from the cottage window. Her father did not come to the cottage. He went to the smithy. The smithy door was open in the October cool because Jude kept it open when he was working and didn't have reason to close it. She could see the orange light from the forge and the darker shape of her father going through the door. She did not go out. She sat at the window with Mina in her arms and watched the smithy and waited. It was perhaps 40 minutes. Her father came out alone. He stood in the yard for a moment with his hat in his hands. This was not a gesture she associated with him. He wore his hat going in and took it off inside and put it back on coming out. Standing in the yard holding it with no hat movement in either direction was not something she had seen before. It was the gesture of a man who could not find the right posture for what he was feeling, which was the gesture of a man who was feeling something he didn't have a posture for. He looked toward the cottage. She did not move. He looked at the cottage for several seconds. Then he put his hat on and untied the horse and rode south toward the church. She went to the smithy. Jude was at the workbench, not the forge. The kind of work you did at the bench was precision work, detailed work things that required stillness more than heat. She said, "What did he want?" Jude set down the file he was holding. "He said he wanted to know what I would do if someone found out about the passage." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him I would tell the truth." She said, "And what did he say to that?" Jude was quiet for a moment. He said he'd been sending women here for 2 years, 3 of them. He knew about the passage from a woman named Hargrove, who came through in 73 and went back to tell her sister, and her sister told your father when she needed help of the same kind. The fire in the forge settled with a soft fall of coal. She said, "He sent women here and never told you he knew." He said, "No." She said, "And now he's telling you." He says a man came to see him this week. A man from the east with questions about the settlement and about property adjacent to the smithy. She said, "Edgar Pratt." He said, "He didn't name him to me." But yes. She stood in the smithy with the orange light from the forge pressing against the dark outside and thought about her father standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. She said, "Is my father afraid?" Jude said he's been afraid for a long time. I think tonight he decided to do something about it. She said, "What does that mean for us?" He said, "I don't know yet." He picked up the file again. "It's better than the alternative." She said, "Which is?" He said, "Him doing nothing." She went back to the cottage. She sat in the rocking chair with Mina against her shoulder and looked at the window and thought about a man who had stood in a yard holding his hat with nowhere particular to put it. Her father was not a bad man. She had known that even in the worst of it, even on the road before Sweetwater, when the wagon pulled away and there was nothing left to watch. Bad men did not feel the weight of what they did. They put on their hats and moved forward. Only men with some capacity for conscience stood in yards holding hats in the dark, unable to find the right posture for what they were feeling. Whether that capacity was enough for anything useful was a different question. She would find out. 2 days after the Reverend's night visit, Edgar Pratt came to the cottage on Friday morning. He came alone, which was more alarming than if he had brought someone. Men who came alone came with a calculation already made. They had decided before they arrived what the range of possible responses was and had prepared for each of them, and the coming alone was part of the preparation because it removed the social obligation to perform restraint in front of witnesses. He was better looking than she remembered, which was its own kind of information. He had the ease of a man who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere he had decided to go, who had moved through the world in a position that made the movement easy, and had never had occasion to learn the skills that difficulty taught. His clothes were trail dusty but good underneath the dust. He stood at the gate with his hat off, in an expression that had been assembled carefully to appear sincere. He said, "Cora." She stood in the cottage doorway with Mina against her shoulder and said nothing. He said, "You look well." She said, "What do you want, Edgar?" He said, "I'd like to come in." She said, "No." A brief pause. He had expected different. He said, "I've been thinking about you, about the situation." He said it with the careful intonation of someone who had practiced the sentence, who had decided on the word situation, and was using it to contain something he didn't want to name more specifically. "I was wrong to do what I did. I know that." She looked at him. She said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want to make it right." He looked at Mina. "She should have a father, a name. You should have a proper life." She said, "I have a life." He looked past her into the cottage, at the stove, at the cradle, at the small room that was hers and her daughter's, and that was, she realized as she watched him look at it, the first space in 20 years that was actually hers without condition. He said, "This isn't what you deserve." She said, "No. What I have is better than what I deserve according to everyone in this territory who has had an opinion about it. So that's not your argument." He said, "Cora." She said, "Tell me what you actually want." Something shifted behind his eyes. The practiced expression didn't leave, but something underneath it moved. Something that had been held in place by the practiced expression and was now less successfully held. He said, "I want what's best for the child." She said, "You don't know the child." He said, "I know she needs a name." She said, "She has one." He blinked. She said, "Her name is Mina. She has it because I gave it to her. She'll have more names as she needs them, and I'll give her those too." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The arrangement you have here, with the blacksmith." He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who was implying something he didn't want to say directly, who was using the word arrangement to do a certain amount of work without requiring him to be specific. "It won't last?" She said, "No." He said, "People in this town." She said, "I know what people in this town think. They've been very clear about it." He said, "You need protection. Whatever you think of me, you need something I can provide." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "What is it that you actually want from this settlement, Edgar? Not from me, from Sweetwater, from the property here." Something in his face went still. She had touched the edge of something. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she had touched it, and she saw it move in his expression, the way ground moved when something under it shifted. He said, "I just want to help you." She said, "Then go to Denver and send money through a bank and don't come back here." He put his hat on. He said, "I'll call again." She said, "You'll make that choice." He walked back to the road. She watched him go. He did not look back, which was how she knew the conversation had not ended for him, even though he was leaving it. A man who looks back when he leaves is finished with the thing he's leaving. A man who doesn't look back is still calculating. She went inside. She set Mina down in the cradle. She went to the bedroom and took the cloth bookmark from the small box on the dresser and held it for a moment. Eleanor Pratt. March 1866, one infant daughter. Edgar had been 25 in 1866. His mother had passed through this settlement with a baby he may or may not have known existed. Had come to the underground passage behind the smithy of a man no one paid attention to, and had stayed 6 weeks recovering from whatever had made her need to come, and had gone on to Laramie. The stillness in his face when she had asked about the settlement, that was not the stillness of a man thinking about a woman. That was the stillness of a man thinking about something that mattered more than a woman and who had just been asked a question that came closer to it than he was prepared for. She needed to know what it was before he moved on whatever calculation had brought him here. She went to find Jude. The marshal's papers arrived on Monday of the following week. A deputy rode up from the county seat with a sealed document and left it at the smithy gate and was gone before Jude had finished reading his name on the front. The seal was official. The language inside was the language of official things, which was to say it was thorough and specific and left nothing outside its boundaries. The complaint had been filed by Edgar Pratt of Philadelphia and Cheyenne, citing one Jude Finch Blacksmith of the Sweetwater Settlement, Wyoming Territory, for the offense of harboring women who had abandoned their lawful marital obligations, conducting unlawful commerce through unauthorized channels, and maintaining a concealed structure on private property without registered purpose. A hearing was set for 10 days from the date of the document. The presiding authority would be the territorial marshal's deputy, who would take testimony and determine whether the matter warranted elevation to the circuit judge. Jude read the document once and put it on the workbench. She said 10 days. He said sufficient. She said for what? He said Seth's registration papers should arrive in 8. The boarding house and workshop filing. She said, and if they don't? He said, then we work with what we have. What they had was 2 new women who arrived on Wednesday and a third on Friday. And by the Saturday before the hearing, there were 7 women and 3 children in the Freestone house, which was more than it had held at any one time in its 9 years, because word had moved faster than it usually moved, and the women who needed it most had come faster than they usually came, as if some collective understanding of the urgency had traveled through whatever network of quiet instruction kept the knowledge of the place alive. She went down to the passage every day that week, not just to bring food and water, though she did that, to be present, to sit in the main chamber while the children slept and talk with the women about whatever they wanted to talk about, which was sometimes their situations and sometimes not. Sometimes it was the quality of the water, or the best approach to the small forge, or the price of fabric at the trading post. One of the women had been a schoolteacher in Ohio before her marriage. She was teaching the children their letters on a piece of slate she had found on the passage floor. She did it with the efficient calm of someone returning to a competence that had been interrupted rather than lost, the competence still present in the hands and the voice, even after years of not being used. Cora watched her. She thought, this is what it looks like when you give someone a room and a lamp in 8 days. They get back to who they were before the door closed. The door closing doesn't change who they are. It just prevents access to it. You open the door and give them time, and the person they were walks back in through their own hands and their own voice. Seth's papers arrived on the 8th day. She was in the cottage when Jude brought them in a sealed packet from Denver. He opened them at the kitchen table with the economy of someone opening something important, not hurriedly but without ceremony. She looked over his shoulder. The filing was clean. The language was precise in the way that only a man who had spent years navigating what language was required to protect a thing used language. The boarding house registration gave legal standing to any woman residing on the property. The craft workshop registration covered the ironwork and any other manufactured goods produced and sold through the trading post. In the column for the operator of record, the name was not Jude's, it was hers. She said, Seth put my name. Jude said, I asked him to. She said, why? He looked at the table for a moment. He said, because in Wyoming territory, a woman can hold property and operate a business in her own name. And because if there's a proceeding tomorrow, you'll be better positioned to speak to the legitimacy of the operations if they're yours. She said, and if I lose the proceeding, he said, the liability rests with you rather than me. She said, that's not a reason I would have expected from you. He said, I'm not trying to be protected. She said, what are you trying to do? He said, give you a floor to stand on. She looked at the papers, at her name at the top of the filing. Cora Wells, operator of record. At the registration numbers and the official stamp of the territorial office that made the things she had been doing for a month into a documented fact rather than a private arrangement that anyone with enough power could choose to define as they wished. She thought about $8 in a hem. She thought about the hook she had bent on her 4th try. She thought about Eleanor Pratt and an infant daughter in March of 1866, and a man who had gone still when she asked the wrong question. She said, thank you, Jude. He gathered the papers. He said, get some sleep tonight if you can. She said, and if I can't? He said, then come to the smithy. There's always work that needs doing. She could not sleep. She went to the smithy at midnight and found him exactly where he said he would be at the forge at a low heat, working on something that didn't appear to require the forge at all, which meant he was also not sleeping, and had found the same solution she had found, which was to move your hands when your thoughts wouldn't settle. She sat on the stool in the corner. She said, tell me about the Nashville incident. He kept working. He said Seth mentioned it. She said, he said it's where you got the scar. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set down the tool he was using and looked at what was in his hands. He said there was a woman in a house near the camp. Her husband was a local man with affiliations that put him on the wrong side of the situation. When the regiment moved through, some of the men decided the situation gave them permissions it didn't give them. He said I intervened. The husband had a knife. He said it simply without ornamentation. The way you describe weather. The way you reported facts that were finished. She said, what happened to the woman? He said she got out. Where she went after that, I don't know. I was in the regimental surgeon's tent for 2 weeks. She said, and the men who decided they had permissions. He said they were dealt with through channels. The channels were slower than I would have preferred. He picked up the tool again. That's the story. She said, that's why you built the passage. He said the passage came from understanding that there was a situation and no sufficient structure for addressing it. The Nashville thing was part of that understanding. She said only part. He said there were other parts. He was working again. The forge light moved over the scar on his cheek. There were always other parts. She sat in the smithy until first light. Then she went to get ready. The hearing was held in the marshal's office at the south end of the main street, which was a room large enough for 12 people sitting if they were comfortable with proximity. It was a working room, functional, the walls bare except for a territorial map and a printed list of statutes that had been tacked to a board and was missing several entries from the bottom where someone had at some point needed a piece of paper and taken what was available. By the time Cora arrived, it was already full. This was not a private proceeding. In Sweetwater in October of 1875, there was very little that qualified as private, and a hearing involving the blacksmith and the Reverend's daughter, and an Eastern man with a lawyer from Cheyenne was not going to be conducted in the absence of witnesses if the witnesses could help it. The deputy marshal was a man named Cutler, perhaps 50, with the expression of someone who had been asked to arbitrate a great many disputes in his career and had developed an economy of facial expression as a result. He sat behind the desk. He had a ledger of his own, a legal one, open and ready, the pen in his hand, with the readiness of someone who expected to write. Edgar Pratt was already there. He was seated on the right side of the room with a man who was introduced as a lawyer, brought from Cheyenne Young, with the pressed look of someone who had traveled fast to be here and had prioritized appearance over comfort. He had the preparedness of a man whose purpose was to apply rules carefully, which was a useful skill that Cora respected regardless of who was paying for it. Jude was to her left. She had the boarding house papers in her coat pocket. She had the Freestone House ledger inside her coat against her chest. It was heavier than she had expected when she lifted it this morning, or she had just become more conscious of its weight. The deputy said, "We'll hear the complaint first." Edgar's lawyer stood. The complaint was technical and thorough in the way that complaints assembled by men with specific objectives were thorough. He presented the matter of the concealed structure, the matter of women residing on the property without registry, the matter of commerce conducted through the trading post without business standing. He was precise. He cited the relevant territorial statutes by number and section. He was doing what he had been trained to do, and he was doing it competently. He did not name any of the women who had been through the passage. He could not because he did not know their names, and Cora understood this was itself a small victory. When the lawyer sat, the deputy looked at Jude. He said, "Do you want to speak to this?" Jude said, "I'll listen to what else there is first." The deputy looked at Cora. He said, "Are you here in a formal capacity, Miss Wells?" She said, "I'm the operator of record for the registered boarding house and craft workshop at this property." She produced the papers and gave them to the deputy, filed with the Territorial Records Office through a Denver bank. Received yesterday. The deputy looked at the papers. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted the way eyes shifted when the shape of a proceeding changed without warning, and the person presiding was deciding whether to acknowledge the change or pretend it hadn't happened. He was a man who had been doing this long enough to know when to acknowledge things. Edgar's lawyer said the filing postdates the complaint. She said yes. The business predates both. The filing makes it official. She said it steadily. That's what filings do. The deputy set the papers down on his desk. He looked at the room. He said, "Is there additional testimony?" She stood. She had not planned what she would say in the sense of having written it down or rehearsed it in front of the cottage window. She had thought about it in the smithy at midnight, and in the passage with 7 women sleeping behind her, and in the rocking chair where she had sat every night for a month holding Mina and watching the Wyoming dark outside. But she had not written it down, because writing it down would have made it into a performance, and a performance was not what was needed here. She said, "I'd like to speak to the question of what these proceedings are actually about." The deputy said, "Go ahead." She said, "My father is a minister. He preached a sermon this year from the Gospel of John. The text is about a woman brought before the authorities for moral failure. The authorities propose punishment. The man they brought her to, in the expectation that he'll confirm the punishment, says, 'This let him who is without sin cast the first stone.'" The room was quiet. She said, "My father preached that sermon the Sunday after I came to Sweetwater. I sat in the last pew, and I held my daughter, and I believed at the time that the sermon was directed at me, that it was a pointed commentary on my situation wrapped in holy language." She said, "I understand now that I was wrong about that. The sermon was not directed at me. It was directed at the people sitting in front of me, at the people in this room right now, at everyone who has formed an opinion about what happens to women in this territory when they run out of options." She looked at the deputy. She said, "The structure behind my property is a room where women who have run out of options can exist safely for a brief period of time while they figure out what comes next. It has a lamp and a water supply and a place to sleep. It has a forge room where those women can learn a skill that will allow them to earn money when they leave." She said, "The question before this proceeding is whether the existence of that room is something the law of this territory wants to discourage." She said, "I would note for the record that Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869 and the right to serve on juries in 1870. Whatever this proceeding decides will speak to what those rights were actually worth." She sat. The room was quiet in the way of rooms that are deciding something collectively, the sound of 12 people adjusting their understanding of what had just happened and what it meant for what came next. Mrs. Henley stood. She said, "My name is Ellen Henley. I've operated the trading post on this street for 4 years." She said it with the economy of a woman stating facts for a record, placing each item clearly before moving to the next. "Before I operated the trading post, I was in that passage for 11 days in 1866. I've been helping this operation every way I know how since then." She sat. A woman near the back stood. Cora did not know her. She was perhaps 40, with a face that held something that had taken time to settle into its current expression. The expression of someone who had survived the thing they had needed to survive and come out with most of themselves intact and the rest under deliberate construction. She said, "My name is Dora Alderton. I came through the passage in 1871. I have a seamstress business in Laramie now." She paused. "I have 2 employees." She sat. Another woman stood. She was younger, not from Sweetwater. She had come, Cora would learn later, specifically for the hearing, specifically for this moment, traveling 2 days to stand up in a room and say her name and the year and what the passage had meant for the year that followed. Then another. Cora did not count, but she watched Edgar. He was looking at the women as they stood and spoke. Each one. His practiced composure was not entirely intact anymore. Something was working behind it, the calculation running into information it hadn't anticipated, the plan encountering a dimension it had not included. She waited until the last woman had sat. Then she reached inside her coat and took out the Freestone House ledger. She walked to where the deputy was sitting and put the ledger on his desk. She said, "This is a complete record of every person who has come through the passage. Dates, conditions, destinations. 9 years of it." She turned to Edgar. She said, "I'd like Mr. Pratt to look at one entry in particular." Edgar's lawyer said, "I object to the introduction of." She said, "It's a private ledger, not a legal document. I'm asking a man to look at something I found. I don't believe there's a procedure that prevents that." The deputy looked at the lawyer. The lawyer said nothing more. She picked up the ledger and opened it to the marker. She walked to Edgar and held it in front of him. He looked down at it. Eleanor Pratt, March 1866. Arrived from Cheyenne. 1 infant daughter, approximately 6 weeks. Mother in poor condition, recovering. Departed April 1866 toward Laramie with contact provided. She watched him read it. She watched him read it a second time. She said, "Your mother's name was Eleanor. You were 25 in 1866. Whether you knew she left or why she left, only you can say. What the record shows is that she came through this passage with a child, an infant girl approximately 6 weeks old." She said it quietly, not as an accusation, as the reading of a document. She said, "I don't know if you were looking for your mother when you came here. I don't know if you were looking for the child. I don't know if you knew the child existed. I'm giving you the same information this ledger gave me because you have a right to know it exists." She closed the ledger. She went back to her seat. The room was quiet. Edgar sat looking at the place the ledger had been. His face had changed in a way that was not the change of a calculation encountering an obstacle. It was the change of a man encountering something that had nothing to do with calculation that existed in a register where calculation was not the right tool. His lawyer said something to him in a low voice. Edgar did not appear to hear it. He stood. He walked out of the hearing without speaking. His lawyer gathered his papers with the expression of a man who had been engaged to do a specific task and had arrived at a moment where the task no longer existed in the form he had been given it. He left after his client. The deputy looked at the room. He looked at the registration papers from Seth Barrow's filing. He said the complaint as filed refers to an unregistered structure operating outside the law. The documentation shows a registered business in good standing with the territorial office. He said, "I'm going to find that the complaint has no basis for elevation to the circuit judge." He closed his own ledger. He said, "That's the end of it." The room moved. Chairs scraped. Voices started. Mrs. Henley crossed to Cora and put a hand on her arm briefly and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The brief weight of another person's hand was the right form for what needed to be communicated. Jude was at her side. He said nothing either. She looked at the door Edgar had gone through. She thought about a woman called Eleanor Pratt in March of 1866, coming to a half-finished passage behind a blacksmith shop with an infant who had been alive 6 weeks. Coming because there was nowhere else. Coming because someone had pointed her toward a man who kept a lamp burning and didn't ask questions. What Edgar did with what he now knew was his to carry. She had given him the information. She could not give him what to do with it. Some things could only be worked out by the person who needed to work them out, and attempting to do it for them was a form of taking something that wasn't yours to take. That was his work, not hers. Her father came that evening. He came to the cottage this time. He knocked at the front door, which was the first time he had knocked at any door of hers. She opened it and stood in the doorway with Mina on her shoulder and looked at him. He was in his Sunday coat, which was not what he wore on Wednesdays. He had dressed carefully, which meant this visit had been decided upon earlier in the day, which meant it was not an impulse but a commitment. He said, "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in. He held his hat. He sat down at the table without being invited, then seemed to realize this was no longer a house where he could determine the seating, and started to stand again. And she said, "Sit down, Father," and he sat. He looked at Mina. Mina looked back at him with the complete attention that infants gave to things they were encountering for the first time. His face, his hat in his hands, the specific quality of his stillness. She had no information yet about who he was or what his presence meant, and was simply receiving him as information. She brought him coffee because she was her mother's daughter and the part that needed something to do with her hands when the situation was too large to hold without an activity. She sat across from him. He said, "I heard about the hearing." She said, "News travels." He said, "I should have been there." She said, "Yes." He said, "I should have been on that side of the room from the beginning." He said it to his coffee cup. "Since before you came back, since before the women I sent." She said, "The ones you sent in 73. He said, "And 2 before that." She stopped. She looked at him. He looked at the cup. "In 71, I found a woman sheltering in the church cellar. I didn't know what to do with her, so I asked around carefully, and someone told me about Jude Finch. He said I have been using what he built without ever standing in front of it." He said it with the particular shame of a man who has been honest with himself about something and is now being honest with someone else about it, which is the harder of the two. Being honest with yourself is private. Being honest with someone else is a gift of your honesty to them, which means they see it, which means it cannot be taken back. She said, "Why are you here now?" He said, "Because I would like to ask your forgiveness." He looked at her then. Not easily. With the effort of a man who has spent a long time looking away from things and is now making himself look directly. "I would like to ask it for what I did on the road before this town, and for the letter I sent, and for every Sunday you sat in that last pew while I talked about mercy without practicing it." She sat with that. She said, "I don't have the complete version of forgiveness ready tonight." She said it without cruelty, just with honesty, I've been working on it for a month and it's not finished. He said, I understand. She said, but what I can tell you is that what you did tonight by coming here is a step in the direction where I'm eventually going to end up. He said, that's more than I expected. She said, don't take it as permission to go slowly. Something moved in his face. Something that looked, if you looked at it carefully, like the beginning of something that might eventually become a smile. He said, I came to ask you something else as well. She waited. He said, I would like to perform the wedding ceremony. If Jude will have me do it. If you will. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had written 4 sentences and no salutation and sent her away from everything she had known. At the man who had stood in a yard in the dark, holding his hat in both hands. At the man who was sitting at her table asking for the chance to do something that would require him to stand in front of his entire congregation and publicly acknowledge the decision he had made and the decision he was now making and the relationship between those two decisions. She said, when? He said, whenever you're ready. She said, ask Jude tomorrow. He put on his hat. He left. She sat at the table with her coffee and Mina against her shoulder and the Wyoming night coming in cold around the edges of the door, and thought about what it meant that a man who had written, do not contact the family in an ink as certain as any he had ever used was now coming through the door of her family, asking for the chance to make something. She thought it was not enough. She thought it was not nothing. She thought most things that mattered lived in the space between those two assessments. The space was not comfortable, and it was not simple, and it was not finished, and in that, it was exactly like everything else that was actually alive. The ceremony was 3 weeks later. The church was not full. This was not the kind of wedding that drew curiosity seekers, because it was not the kind of wedding that required an audience. The people who came were the people who had chosen to come, which made them a different quality of witness than a crowd assembled out of habit or social obligation or the desire to see what would happen. Mrs. Henley was there. Seth Barrow had come back from Denver having heard about the hearing through a letter from Jude that had reached him 6 days after it happened. He sat in the second pew with his hat in his lap and the expression of a man who had invested in something and was watching it pay dividends that went beyond what he had calculated. 3 women from the settlement who had made their own decisions about who to stand beside and had stood during the hearing were there. Dora Alderton, who had come from Laramie. 2 others Cora had not met before who introduced themselves briefly before the service with the handshakes of people who understood what kind of occasion this was and were equal to it. Her mother was there, seated in the 3rd pew, not the first, which meant she had come, but had not assumed a position. She had dressed carefully. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the altar with the expression of a woman who has spent a long time finding the right posture for complicated love and is now sitting in it. Her sisters were with her. The eldest, the 12-year-old who had watched from under the wagon canvas and held Cora's gaze for a moment before looking away, was sitting with her hands folded in a posture that was her mother's, which was the posture she was learning. The youngest looked at Cora with the expression she had been holding in the wagon and had apparently kept stored all this time, which was the expression of someone waiting to find out whether it was all right to feel what they were feeling. Jude stood at the front of the church in his good coat and without his hat, and with the expression of a man who had decided on something and was comfortable with the decision. Not nervous, not performing anything, just present, which was its own form of abundance. She walked down the aisle carrying Mina. The light in the church was the afternoon light of October in Wyoming, which came in low and yellow through the windows and made everything look like the inside of a lantern. The floorboards were uneven from years of settling, and the pews were worn, and the cross at the front was plain wood with no ornament, the work of someone who had understood that the thing itself was sufficient without decoration. Her father performed the ceremony with the economy of a man who understood that the occasion was not about his words. He used few of them. He used the ones that were required and a few more that were his own, which included a sentence she had not expected. He said, I am performing this ceremony in the acknowledgement that what is being built here has more foundation than I had the wisdom to see when I should have seen it. He said it plainly, with no elaboration, and then he continued. They said what was required to be said. Jude put the ring on her finger with steady hands. She had made it. At the small forge in the freestone house on a Tuesday afternoon with Mina sleeping in a folded blanket on the floor nearby, and the lamp on the high shelf, and the sound of the limestone around her doing what limestone had always done, which was hold. Iron, not silver. Not because they couldn't obtain silver, but because iron was what they were. It was what the passage was built from, what the brackets were. What the brackets that held the lamps were what the tools in the forge room were. Iron bent and shaped by heat and quenched to its permanent form. Hard and honest and made by hand. She had bent it carefully. She had quenched it. She had held it up. It was not beautiful. It was exactly what it needed to be. After the ceremony, her father brought out the baptismal record and wrote Mina's name in it with the same precise penmanship that had written 4 sentences and no salutation on a letter she still had at the bottom of the small box on the dresser, would always have not, because the letter was a thing to cherish, but because it was a document of where they had started from, and where was that mattered as much as where they had arrived. He wrote Mina Finch, daughter of Cora and Jude Finch, and the date. He set the pen down. He said, "I'm sorry it took so long." She looked at the name in the record, at the ink drying on the page, at her daughter's name in her father's handwriting, which was the handwriting she had known all her life, which was now doing something different with itself. She said, "It's there now." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's what matters." Her mother came to her after outside the church in the October light and held Mina for a long time without saying much. She looked at Mina with the expression of a woman recognizing something, though what she was recognizing was not entirely clear, whether it was the child or her daughter in the child, or something older than either of them. She pressed her lips together. She returned Mina with the care of someone returning something they understood was not theirs to keep, and were returning willingly, not because they were required to, but because it was right. She said, "She looks like you did." Cora said, "I know." She said, "Come to dinner on Sunday." She said it the way you said something you had been deciding to say for a long time and had finally said. Cora said, "We'll come." The Freestone House registration became official the week after the wedding. Seth sent the confirmation document with a note that said, "Properly recorded and legally irrefutable," in 7 pages of close print, which I will spare you. "The business status stands. Good luck with the next 10 years." She read the confirmation at the kitchen table and set it with the other papers in the wooden box where she kept the things that needed to be kept. The letter from her father, the registration papers, the confirmation, the record of Mina's baptism that her father had given her a copy of. She thought about the next 10 years. She thought about what they looked like from here, which was different from how she had thought about the next 10 years in any previous version of thinking about them. Before, the future had been a thing to survive, to reach, a destination that justified whatever the present required. You endured the present in order to get to the future, and the future would be worth the enduring. Now it looked like work, like the particular work that came from understanding what needed to be built and deciding to build it. Not because the building would be finished, not because there was a point at which you would be done and could rest, but because the building was itself the life, and the life was what you were actually doing while you were waiting for something else to begin, which was not comfortable or uncomplicated or finished, which was better than the alternative, which was, if she was honest with herself in the way that hard months had taught her to be honest, better than anything she had imagined when she was standing on the road before Sweetwater watching the wagon disappear into its own dust. A woman arrived in November. She came the way most of them came, by a route that had been pointed out to her by someone who had been through it themselves. The knowledge of the passage traveled through a network she could not fully trace, passed from woman to woman in the form of a direction and a name, both of them short enough to fit in a sentence that could be delivered quietly and forgotten if necessary. She arrived at the smithy gate in the early evening with a child and a bundle, and the expression of someone who had been making decisions for a long time on insufficient information and was very tired of it. Not broken, tired, which was different. Tired was temporary. Broken meant something structural had failed, and you couldn't rebuild from it. This woman was tired, and she was standing upright, and she was at the gate, which meant she still had the thing you needed to have to get to the gate. Jude brought her to the cottage. Cora made tea. She told the woman what the passage was and how it worked, and what the expectation was in terms of time, and what came after in terms of the arrangement to the west, where it was easier to begin again. She told her about the forge room, The woman said, "I've never worked with metal." Cora said, "I know." Neither had I. She said, "I'm not strong enough for smithing." Cora said, "You don't need to be." She set the tin cup on the table. "What you need to be able to do is hold a pair of tongs and maintain a consistent grip. Everything else is a question of learning the fire." She said, "I'll teach you tomorrow." In the morning, she took the woman down through the passage and lit the lamp in the forge room and built up the fire in the small forge to the right temperature and put the tongs in her hands and showed her how to hold them. She showed her how to hold them, not the natural grip, but the functional one, the grip that kept the wrist in the right relationship to the shoulder for the duration of the work, which was not the same as the grip you would use to hold anything else. She showed her how to read the color of the iron, how to wait for the right moment, and how to recognize when the moment had arrived, which was not a thing you could describe precisely because the description would always lag the reality. You had to look at it yourself long enough to know. She showed her how to move with decision rather than hesitation because the metal required it, because indecision in the presence of heat cost you the window, and you had to start again, and starting again was fine. You could always start again, but it was better to move when you knew. The woman made her first hook on the third attempt. She held it up. It was not beautiful. It was exactly what it needed to be. She looked at it with the expression of someone discovering something they did not know was possible. Not the impossible thing, not a miracle. Something more ordinary and more important than a miracle. The discovery that their own hands could make a thing. That the thing in the world was different because of what they had done with their own hands. Cora said nothing. Because some moments were complete by themselves and adding words to them was the wrong kind of help. The moment was the moment's own. You witnessed it without claiming it. Outside, the Wyoming winter was settling into the territory with the permanence that Wyoming winters had, the kind that intended to stay and meant it. The prairie went gray and then white. The cottonwoods along the creek dropped their last leaves and stood bare against the sky with the unself-conscious clarity of things that had stopped pretending. The smithy fire burned higher. The cottage kept its warmth because Jude had built the cottage to hold warmth, and it did the walls thick and the windows fitted, and the stove fed with the right amount of coal at the right intervals by someone who had learned the rhythm of it and did not need to be reminded. The lamp in the passage below the hill burned every night. It had burned every night for 9 years, and it would burn for 9 more, and 9 after that, because that was what lamps did when someone was committed to filling them. When someone understood that the maintenance of the light was not optional, that the maintenance was the whole of it, that there was no eventual state in which the light would maintain itself. You filled the reservoir, you trimmed the wick, you kept the lamp burning. That was the work. That was what the work looked like when you did it every night for 9 years, without audience and without recognition and without certainty that the next person who came down the passage would be the last person who would need it. And in the forge room at the bottom of the limestone hill, under the plains of Wyoming, in the winter of 1875, 2 women stood over a small fire and did the work that work required. The iron in the woman's tongs was the right color now. Cora said now. The woman moved, which was enough. Which was in the end what enough had always looked like when you were standing inside it.